Alright, this is AW coming at you along with Hyperion to comment on Mao Zedong's work on contradiction. Seeing as I opened my big mouth on this and started an interesting Twitter and Lefty Poll thread that just went on and does not stop on this, I decided, you know what? What the hell? Let's read Mao. Let's see what he has to say. Alright, starting the essay. Reading the one that's on Marxist Internet Archive. It begins. The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the basic law of materialist dialectics. Already starting on the bad foot, Mao. Already starting on the bad foot. Dialectical laws, man. Lenin said, dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. Lenin often called this law the essence of dialectics. He also called it the kernel of dialectics. In studying this law, therefore, we cannot but touch upon a variety of questions, upon a number of philosophical problems. If we can become clear on all these problems, we shall arrive at a fundamental understanding of materialist dialectics. Trademarked. The problems are: 1. The two world outlooks, the universality of contradiction, the particularity of contradiction, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction, the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction, and the place of antagonism in contradiction. So I'm definitely not coming at it from a Hegelian perspective. Hegel would usually, you can see structures here that are similar to Hegel's, but not quite different from how he would himself would ever term them. The criticism to which the idealism of the Deboran school has been subjected in Soviet philosophical circles in recent years has aroused great interest among us. Deboran's idealism has exerted a very bad influence in the Chinese Communist Party. It cannot be said that the dogmatist thinking in our party is unrelated to the approach of that school. Our present study of philosophy should therefore have the eradication of dogmatist thinking as its main objective. Section 1. The two world outlooks. Throughout the history of human knowledge, there have been two conceptions concerning the law of development of the universe, the metaphysical conception and the dialectical conception, which form two opposing world outlooks. I don't know what the hell he's talking about, and I've studied philosophy. I have never heard of this, ever. So I don't know what he means, but let's see. Lenin said, the two basic, or two possible, or two historically observable, conceptions of development, evolution are development as decrease and increase, as repetition, and development as a unity of opposites, the division of a unity into mutually exclusive opposites and their reciprocal relation. End quote. Here Lenin was referring to these two different world outlooks. Well, it seems to me Lenin was not aware of Plato or Aristotle, because Plato and Aristotle have a lot more to say about development than just those things, even though they do recognize those things. Teleology, man. Continuing. In China, another name for metaphysics is Xuan Sui. For a long period in history, whether in China or in Europe, this way of thinking, which is part and parcel of the idealist world outlook, occupied a dominant position in human thought. In Europe, the materialism of the bourgeoisie in its early days was also metaphysical. As the social economy of many European countries advanced to the stage of highly developed capitalism, as the forces of production, the class struggle, and the sciences developed to a level unprecedented in history, and as the industrial proletariat became the greatest motive force in historical development, there arose the Marxist world outlook of materialist dialectics. Then, in addition to open and bare-faced reactionary idealism, vulgar evolutionism emerged among the bourgeoisie to oppose materialist dialectics. I don't think so, Mao, because the bourgeoisie literally did not care about Hegel or Marx. They weren't formulating their ideas against them. They just did their own thing. Continuing, the metaphysical or vulgar evolutionist world outlook sees things as isolated, static, and one-sided, and regards all things in the universe. It regards all things in the universe, their forms and their species, as eternally isolated from one another and immutable. Such change as there is can only be an increase or decrease in quantity or a change of place. I honestly don't know who he's talking about. Because if he's talking about Darwin, like, what the hell, no. Moreover, the cause of such an increase or decrease or change of place is not inside things, but outside them. That is, the motive force is external. Metaphysicians hold that all the different kinds of things in the universe and all their characteristics have been the same ever since they first came into being. All subsequent changes have simply been increases or decreases in quantity. Seriously, who is he talking about?
I don't know.
Yeah, like, who is he talking about? Like, I don't even know. He's not talking about the analytics, because the analytics were just like, oh, Darwin's right. And Darwin wasn't about, like, increasing quantities or decreases. I don't know who he's talking about, but it definitely isn't any general trend in the West that I'm aware of. Yeah, maybe it's a trend in his, his area. They contend that a thing can only keep on repeating itself as the same thing, a kind of thing, and cannot change into anything different. In their opinion, capitalist exploitation, capitalist competition, the individualist ideology of capitalist society, and so on, can all be found in ancient slave society, or even in primitive society, and will exist forever unchanged. They ascribe the causes of social development to factors external to society, such as geography and climate. They search in an oversimplified way outside a thing for the causes of its development. And they deny the theory of materialist dialectics, which holds that developments arise from the contradictions inside a thing. Consequently, they can explain neither the qualitative diversity of things, nor the phenomena of one quality changing into another. In Europe, this mode of thinking existed as mechanical materialism in the 17th and 18th centuries, and as vulgar evolutionism at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. In China, there was the metaphysical thinking exemplified in the saying, "Heaven changeth not, likewise the Tao changeth not." And it was supported by the decadent feudal ruling class for a long time. Mechanical materialism and vulgar revolutionism, which were imported from Europe in the last 100 years, are supported by the bourgeoisie. I always found this attack to be, like, cartoonish, because, like, when you encounter, like, a normal person, nobody ever thought this way. Like, nobody said, oh, capitalism is eternal in the way he's saying it. It's like, people would point back and say, look, capitalism is the nature of things, that's why we're heading towards capitalism. We were deluded and we had all these other things going on. We believed spooky ideas like God and religion, and that's why we had feudalism. But, the reality is that, the reason they fell apart is because freedom was breaking through, and, we're heading, freedom is capitalism or something. So they can very much account for why things changed from their own perspective. That there was no such problem. So, yeah. Continuing. As opposed to the metaphysical world outlook, the world outlook of materialist dialectics holds that in order to understand the development of a thing, we should study it internally and in its relations with other things. In other words, the development of things should be seen as their internal and necessary self-movement, while each thing in its movement is interrelated with and interacts on the things around it. Okay, that's pretty good. The fundamental cause of development of a thing is not external, but internal. It lies in the contradictoriness within the thing. There is internal contradiction in every single thing, hence its motion and development. That starts getting formalistic about this, and we'll see if he has it right or not. Because the fundamental cause of development of a thing is not external but internal. Only if you're literally talking about the fundamental cause of a fundamental thing. Doesn't apply to every single thing. Only very specific certain things have this quality of fundamentality to them, such that they could be their own fundamental cause from within. So anyways, continuing. Contradictoriness within a thing is the fundamental cause of its development, while its interrelations and interactions with other things are secondary causes. Thus, materialist dialectics effectively combats the theory of external causes or of an external motive force advanced by metaphysical mechanical materialism and vulgar evolutionism. So once again, if he's talking about the thing as thing, for example, a chicken as chicken, the fundamental cause of the development of a chicken is to be found in the thing as a chicken, not the thing as matter, not the thing as cells, not the thing as an ecology, but chicken. If that's what it means, okay, he's right. It is evident that purely external causes can only give rise to mechanical motion, that is, to changes in scale or quantity, but cannot explain why things differ qualitatively in thousands of ways, and why one thing changes into another. And seemed like a non sequitur point to me. But also not completely false, but in the way he phrases it, not completely true either. Continuing, as a matter of fact, even mechanical motion under external force occurs through the internal contradictoriness of things. Simple growth in plants and animals, or quantitative development, is likewise chiefly the result of their internal contradictions. This constant appeal to internal contradictions is formalistic so far. There's no explanation of contradictions yet. Similarly, social development is due chiefly not to external but to internal causes. I don't know, man. Is it? Does that explain why Rome fell apart? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I could totally consider a situation in which totally external things cause the downfall of society. Pompeii, a fucking volcano, forces of nature. A famine can end a society.
Yeah, famine, I would say, slightly internal, but yeah. I mean, it could be the result of just nature, but
Yep. So continuing, countries with almost the same geographical and climatic conditions display great diversity and unevenness in their development. Moreover, great social changes may take place in one and the same country, although its geography and climate remain unchanged. Imperialist Russia changed into the Socialist Soviet Union, and feudal Japan, which had locked its doors against the world, changed into Imperialist Japan, although no change occurred in geography and climate of either country. Long dominated by feudalism, China has undergone great changes in the last 100 years and is now changing in the direction of a new China, liberated and free, and yet no change has occurred in her geography and climate. Well, the fact that the West opened up China is a pretty big external change now. I mean, he's talking about very physical external changes, whereas external change can just be just about anything that isn't socially internal, as far as society goes. Changes do take place in geography and climate of the Earth as a whole and every part of it, but they are insignificant when compared with changes in society. Geographical and climatic changes manifest themselves in terms of tens of thousands of years, while social change manifests themselves in thousands, hundreds, or tens of years, and even in a few years or months in times of revolution. According to materialist dialectics, changes in nature are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in nature. Whatever contradictions mean so far. No explanation. Continuing, changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society, that is, the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes and the contradiction between the old and the new, It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the supersession of the old society by the new. Somehow culture does not play a role, apparently. I mean, I don't think we would materially be anywhere had it not been for Newton's magnificent formalization of the laws of gravity and the beginning of physics in the modern sense. Continuing, does materialist dialectics exclude external causes? Not at all. It holds that external causes are the condition of change and internal causes are the basis of change, and that external causes become operative through internal causes. In a suitable temperature, an egg changes into a chicken, but no temperature can change a stone into a chicken because each has a different basis. All right, that makes sense. So basically, you can see that as conditions of possibility, and then the actual thing which is going to be enabled by that possibility. Two different things. Continuing, there is a constant interaction between the peoples of different countries. In the era of capitalism, and especially in the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, the interaction and mutual impact of different countries in the political, economic, and cultural spheres are extremely great. The October Socialist Revolution ushered in a new epoch in world history as well as in Russian history. It exerted influence on internal changes in other countries in the world, and similarly, and in particular, in a particularly profound way, on internal changes in China. These changes, however, were effected through the inner laws of development of these countries, China included. In battle, one army is victorious and the other is defeated. Both the victory and the defeat are determined by internal causes. The one is victorious either because it is strong or because of its competent generalship. The other is vanquished either because it is weak or because of its incompetent generalship. It is through internal causes that external causes become operative. I don't know, I think there's been battles won which are just luck. Quite a bit of luck.
Yeah, I agree.
Continuing, in China in 1927, the defeat of the proletariat by the big bourgeoisie came about through the opportunism then to be found within the Chinese proletariat itself, inside the Chinese Communist Party. When we liquidated this opportunism, the Chinese Revolution resumed its advance. Later, the Chinese Revolution again suffered severe setbacks at the hands of the enemy, because adventurism had risen within our party. When we liquidated this adventurism, our cause advanced once again. Thus can be seen that to lead the revolution to victory, a political party must depend on the correctness of its own political line and the solidity of its own organization. But what is the basis of the correctness of this political line, Mao? That is the question. Continuing, the dialectical world outlook emerged in ancient times both in China and in Europe. Ancient dialectics, however, had a somewhat spontaneous and naive character in the social and historical conditions then prevailing. It was not yet able to form a theoretical system, hence it could not fully explain the world and was supplanted by metaphysics. Plato, anybody? The famous German philosopher Hegel, who lived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, made most important contributions to dialectics, but his dialectics was idealist. As if you know what that means, Mao. It was not until Marx and Engels, the great protagonists of the proletarian movement, had synthesized the positive achievements in the history of human knowledge and, in particular, critically absorbed the rational elements of Hegelian dialectics and created the great theory of dialectical and historical materialism that an unprecedented revolution occurred in the history of human knowledge. Not quite. This theory was further developed by Lenin and Stalin. As soon as it spread to China, it wrought tremendous changes in the world of Chinese thought. But what about Chinese science? What about Lysenko? Continuing. This dialectical world outlook teaches us primarily how to observe and analyze the movement of opposites in different things, and on the basis of such analysis, to indicate the methods for resolving contradictions. It is therefore most important for us to understand the law of contradiction in things in a concrete way. I'll, I'll just go ahead and say it. That's bullshit. Because historically this has happened without anybody having ever realized that they were doing any such thing as dialectics. Contradictions have been resolved in the history of the world without anybody having ever realized that there was something dialectical going on. It just happened.
Yeah.
Like, it just happened. Like, the contradictions of capital, nobody came up and it's like, wow, we really need to think dialectically to fix this. No, capital just naturally did it. Like, it resolved its contradictions. How? Did it know that they were contradictions? Probably for a short moment in history, like, theoreticians thought, like, wow, this is a problem. And then they just fixed it. And nobody, like, ever thought, it's like, wow, we're doing something, like, awesome and, like, genuinely peculiar. It was just regular thinking. A new way of doing things came about, and nobody ever noticed that it was anything to do with some special kind of thinking. It was just regular thinking and a new set of conditions. That's all it was. So this idea that you need dialectics in order to find the right way to do things, that's bullshit. Mao himself never, like, I guarantee you, just thought like a normal person who just like, how do I fix this? Well, how do you fix it? You don't have to think dialectically at all. It's mostly very pragmatic. And it just happens to be that in pragmatism, you end up finding the things that actually work. So that was the first section. Not very informative in my opinion. If I was somebody completely new to this, reading this, I definitely would still have a lot of questions. Section 2. The Universality of Contradiction. For convenience of exposition, I shall deal first with the universality of contradiction and then proceed to the particularity of contradiction. The reason is that the universality of contradiction can be explained more briefly, for it has been widely recognized ever since the materialist dialectical world outlook was discovered, and materialist dialectics applied with outstanding success to analyzing many aspects of human history and natural history, and to changing many aspects of society and nature, as in the Soviet Union, by the great creators and continuers of Marxism, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. Whereas the particularity of contradiction is still not clearly understood by many comrades, and especially by the dogmatists. I'll call bullshit on that too. The universality of contradictions is one of the earliest things in human history, like of philosophy. Like, no joke, like Heraclitus had this, and the metaphysical dialectical monists, quote unquote metaphysical, they were metaphysical, they had it. Like, they understood, and they could give you, it's like, here's contradictions right here. You see them everywhere. Where do you have anything that's not contradictory? The Taoists can show you everything is contradictory. Like, it is, as Mao says, the simplest thing to notice. And so it was not something discovered by Marx and Engels, or even Hegel. It's something discovered very, very early on in philosophy and basically human culture. Continuing. They do not understand that it is precisely in the particularity of contradiction that the universality of contradiction resides. Okay. It's pretty good, depending on what he means. Nor do they understand how important is the study of the particularity of contradiction, the concrete things confronting us for guiding the course of revolutionary practice. Therefore, it is necessary to stress the study of the particularity of contradiction and to explain it at adequate length. For this reason, in our analysis of the law of contradiction in things, we shall first analyze the universality of contradiction, then place special stress on analyzing the particularity of contradiction, and finally return to the universality of contradiction. The universality or absoluteness of contradiction has a twofold meaning. One is that contradiction exists in the process of development of all things, and the other is that in the process of development of each thing, a movement of opposites exists from the beginning to end. Um, the fact that he's focusing on process here rather than structure too misses one of the points. Structure is definitely important. The moment in which you stand back and freeze the dialectic and go, aha, so this is what the structure of the contradiction is like, is important. Continuing, Engels said, quote, motion itself is a contradiction, unquote. Lenin defined the law of the unity of opposites as the, quote, the recognition, discovery of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, including mind and society, unquote. Are these ideas correct? Yes, they are. Well, thank you, Mao. Thank you. I would not have known. I would have loved if he said, no, they aren't. That would have been like, wow.
Yeah.
That would have been definitely a shocker. Continuing, the interdependence of the contradictory aspects present in all things and the struggle between these aspects determine the life of all things and push the development forward. There is nothing that does not contain contradiction, and without contradiction, nothing would exist. It's a Hegelian truism right there, but one must explain what that means. He definitely has an emphasis on development, which I think is one-sided. There's a moment, it's one-sided. There's a moment in which you have to stand back and like actually know what the structure is. Continuing. Contradiction is the basis of the simple forms of motion, for instance, mechanical motion, and still more so of the complex forms of motion. I wish he explained this contradiction of motion. Continuing, Engels explained the universality of contradiction as follows. Quote, if simple mechanical change of place contains a contradiction, this is even more true of the higher forms of motion, of matter, and especially of organic life and its development. Life consists precisely and primarily in this, that a being is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore also a contradiction which is present in things and processes themselves, and which constantly originates and resolves itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end, and death steps in. We likewise saw that also in the sphere of thought we could not escape contradictions, and that, for example, the contradiction between man's inherently unlimited capacity for knowledge and its actual presence only in men, who are externally limited and possess limited cognition, finds its solution in what is, at least practically for us, an endless succession of generations and infinite progress. One of the basic principles of higher mathematics is the contradiction that in certain circumstances straight lines and curves may be the same. But even lower mathematics teems with contradiction, end quote. A lot of claims right there, virtually no actual explanation. Which is my problem with this so far. A lot of claims, no actual explanation. Continuing, Lenin illustrated the universality of contradictions as follows. Quote, in mathematics, plus and minus, differential and integral. End quote. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms. In social science, the class struggle. In war, offense and defense, advance and retreat, victory and defeat are all mutually contradictory phenomena. One cannot exist without the other. The two aspects are at once in conflict and in interdependence, and this constitutes the totality of war, pushes its development forward, and solves its problems. I don't know, man. I don't think some of these are perfectly contradictory. Like, for example, an offense and a defense. Sure, if you're offending, you're not defending, but you can have an offense against an offense. And it'd be a defense. Ooh. So, no. I'll give it to him. He's got that one. He says mutually contradictory phenomena. The fact that an offense can be a defense, an advance can be a retreat or a retreat and advance, and a victory can be a defeat is not mutually contradictory. And that's actually the key thing which Hegelian contradiction has. That is that the positive comes immediately with a negative. There is no temporal distinction. It totally makes sense that a defense could be an offense, a victory can be a defeat, or a defeat can be a victory, and an advance can be in a retreat. Not like you first advance in a retreat. No. Or, your advance is their retreat. No. Your advance can be your own retreat. They're not mutually exclusive. Not at all.
Mm-hmm. Or there could be a Pyrrhic victory.
All right. Continuing. Every difference in man's concept. Every difference in man's concepts should be regarded as reflecting an objective contradiction. Objective contradictions are reflected in subjective thinking, and this process constitutes the contradictory movements of concepts, pushes forward the development of thought, and ceaselessly solves problems in man's thinking. In an abstract way, you can say that every difference in man's concepts should be regarded as reflecting the objective contradiction. But that's not true. There are especially if you read a lot of philosophy, and especially the closer you get to modernity, it becomes even more of a problem, in which people aren't talking about contradicting things. They may actually be talking about the exact same thing, and even from the exact same perspective, and they just don't realize it because they have different terms for it. I mean, it's basically the debate of semantics, man. People who don't realize they're actually talking about the same thing, and they're really in agreement. The difference is not a difference. Continuing, objective contradictions are reflected in subjective thinking, and this process constitutes the contradictory movement of concepts, pushes forward the development of thought, and ceaselessly solves problems in man's thinking. That's just phrased weird. In a way, if I understand that charitably, yeah, okay. It's not the way I would phrase it, and it definitely lacks the nuance of what I would say. Because I would not be talking about objective contradictions reflected in subjective thinking. I'd be talking about objective contradictions reflected in objective thinking. Because subjective thinking can have contradictions which are not real contradictions. At least not dialectical contradictions. Your subjective thinking that, chocolate and spicy just don't go together, Can't have one with the other. That's just literally a subjective opinion. It actually isn't fact. According to culinary experts, it's objectively the opposite. They do go together quite well. I've never had any spicy chocolate, but I sure want to try.
I think I have.
I don't know. People say it's good.
Yeah.
Anyways, continuing. Opposition and struggle between ideas of different kinds constantly occur within the party. This is a reflection within the party of contradictions between classes and between the new and the old in society. I don't know, Mao. Or maybe people just fucking don't agree with you. You ever thought about that? If there were no contradictions in the party and no ideological struggles to resolve them, the party's life would come to an end. Not really. But I mean, admittedly, I don't know what the hell he's talking about by the party. Because if you're thinking about political parties, in the usual sense, absolutely not. So long as there's someone else, the struggle keeps going, buddy. It doesn't have to be internal. So long as you got somebody to fight against, people will fight.
Mm.
Continuing. Thus, it is already clear that contradiction exists universally in all processes, whether in the simple or in the complex forms of motion, whether in the objective phenomena or ideological phenomena. But does contradiction also exist at the initial stage of each process? Well, one, no, it's not already clear that contradiction exists universally, because he didn't really give all-encompassing examples. I mean, he gave a couple examples of specific kind of things, which people can totally miss out and say, go like, well, how is this other thing contradictory? What is the contradiction of breathing, Mao? So, not at all clear. But does contradiction also exist at the initial stage of each process? Is there a movement of opposites from beginning to end in the process of development of every single thing? As can be seen from the articles written by the Soviet philosophers criticizing it, the Deboran school maintains that contradiction appears not at the inception of a process, but only when it has developed to a certain stage. If this were the case, then the case of development of the process before that stage would be external and not internal. Deboran thus reverts to the metaphysical theories of external causality and of mechanism. Applying this view in the analysis of concrete problems, the Deboran school sees only differences, but not contradictions between the kulaks and the peasants in general, under existing conditions in the Soviet Union, thus entirely agreeing with Bukharin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Friend of the mechanists.
So at least from what he's saying for Deboran, I don't see how Deboran is wrong. Because Deboran's right.
What happened was Boren and the dialecticians were opposed by the mechanists, by Lublov Axelrod, and he was like, they would always fight and stuff. And then Stalin came along and said, well, dialectical materialism is the ruling thought of Marxism-Leninism. It kind of like quelled their fighting a bit, I guess.
Well, anyways, the Deboran school maintains that contradiction appears not at the inception of a process, but only when it has developed to a certain stage. That is absolutely true. You don't know there's a contradiction just from like looking at it. I mean, you don't know that there is a contradiction within being until you actually thought being. So the thing about appearance of the contradiction only after a certain stage of the process being done, yeah, that's absolutely true. Mao says, repeating again, if this were the case, then the causes of development of the process before that stage would be external and not external. I don't know where the fuck he's bringing that on, because at least from that prior sentence, that is not at all what's being said. So he says, Deboran thus reverts to the metaphysical theories of external causality and of mechanism, not at all from what was said. So, not that I know what Deboran says, because I never fucking read Deboran, but from what that one sentence, not at all. Applying this view in the analysis of concrete problems, the Deboran school sees only differences but not contradictions between the kulaks and the peasants in general under existing conditions of the Soviet Union, thus entirely agreeing with Bukharin. And I would agree with Deboran if his point was, look, how do you know there is a contradiction between kulaks? That kulaks and peasants just can't live together, can't coexist. How do you know that? Well, you gotta fucking live life to finally know that that is indeed the case. Of course, that's assuming you just don't quite know what a kulak is quite yet, or a peasant, and so you don't have this a priori conceptual distinction which just makes them incompatible already. But from an abstract process of like just coming to look at it from the face of it, yeah, they're right. Of course, you don't know that there's a contradiction at all. Continuing. In analyzing the French Revolution, it holds that before the Revolution there were likewise only differences but not contradictions within the Third Estate, which was composed of the workers, the peasants, and the bourgeoisie. Depending on what they mean, they could be right, they could be wrong. These views of the Bohren school or anti-Marxist, I don't know, Mao. Seems to me like you're just not completely Marxist. They're not like from their perspective, they're not anti-Marxist. The worst you could say is like, well, they weren't fully Marxist. That's about it. Continuing, this school does not understand that each and every difference already contains contradiction, that difference itself is contradiction. And here, strangely, Mao is being metaphysical, because what he's talking about is something on the level of the ontology of things, and it has to do with various kinds of contradiction, which do not necessarily have to be the specific genetic contradiction of the thing as the thing. There's obviously a contradiction between a chicken and its environment. If a chicken goes into a volcano, it's gonna die. If a chicken goes out in space, it's gonna die. If a chicken goes into the Himalayas, it's gonna die. But if it's a nice backyard, full of grass and bugs, it ain't gonna die. It's gonna be a good chicken. It's gonna be in harmony with. It's gonna be in a very nice, comfortable sublation with its environment. Let's just say that. But those contradictions, even though you can talk about them, you could talk about the contradictions of the inner pressure, the physical inner pressures of the chicken and the atmospheric pressure outside it. And that is a legitimate, totally dialectical contradiction. But that's completely irrelevant to the chicken itself. And what we care about is the chicken when we're talking about dialectics here. So Mao is making, strangely, an external dialectical point. Metaphysical indeed.
Yeah.
Continuing, labor and capital have been in contradiction ever since the two classes came into being. Okay. Only at first the contradiction had not yet become intense. Okay. Even under the social conditions existing in the Soviet Union, there is a difference between workers and peasants, and this very difference is a contradiction. Although, unlike the contradiction between labor and capital, it will not become intensified into antagonism or assume the form of a class struggle. Okay. The workers and the peasants have established a firm alliance in the course of socialist construction and are gradually resolving this contradiction in the course of the advance from socialism to communism. What is the contradiction, Mao? Because I can say a lot of contradictions there, but they are not inherent contradictions. The question is one of different kinds of contradiction. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Not of the presence or absence of contradiction. Okay, so we're talking about metaphysical things. Because we can talk about various kinds and various levels of contradiction, and if it's not the contradiction from within, we're not really talking about anything that's of importance at all. Or at least of much interest for the most part. Sometimes it definitely is interesting. It's definitely important, but not when we're trying to talk about like Hegelian or Marxist capital level dialectics. Those are completely internal, and they aren't skipping about but there is a contradiction between the commodity as the object and the subject is consumer. Well, come on, who cares? Continuing, contradiction is universal and absolute. It is present in the process of development of all things and permeates every process from beginning to end. Well, thank you for repeating the same thing again, without explanation, once again. What is meant by the emergence of a new process? The old unity with its constituent opposites yields to a new unity with its constituent opposites, whereupon a new process emerges to replace the old. The old process ends and a new one begins. The new process contains new contradictions, begins in its own history as development of contradictions. But how does this shift happen, Mao? Seeing as Mao is famously denying the negation of negation, denies the unity of opposites as sublation, as affirmative harmony. Who knows
He's just taking them to be...
Yeah, they just come one after the other, A contradiction disappears, another one appears. How? Where do they come from? So, definitely something missing here. Continuing, as Lenin pointed out, Marx in his Capital gave a model of analysis of this movement of opposites, which runs through the process of development of things from beginning to end. This is the method that must be employed in studying development of all things. Yeah. Lenin too employed this method correctly and adhered to it in all his writings. No, no. In his Capital, Marx first analyzes the simplest, most ordinary and fundamental, most common and everyday relation of bourgeois commodity society. A relation encountered billions of times, viz., the exchange of commodities. In this very simple phenomenon, in this cell of bourgeois society, analysis reveals all the contradictions, or the germ of all the contradictions of modern society. The subsequent exposition shows us development, both growth and movement, of these contradictions and of this society in the summation of its individual parts from its beginning to its end. Okay, well, typical thing. Marx basically just paraphrasing what Marx says about himself. Lenin added, quote, such must also be the method of exposition or study of dialectics in general, unquote. Chinese communists must learn this method. Only then will they be able correctly to analyze the history and the present state of the Chinese Revolution and infer its future. So, still a lot of claims, no explanation. I'm waiting.
Yeah.
But let's leave it here for now. We will continue this, and we'll give Mao his due. If since people seem to be very interested. So, all right, we'll leave it at beginning part 3. We'll begin part 3 next time. Any comments, Hyperion? What do you think about this so far?
Well, I don't really have anything to say, I guess. I just want to, see if he explains.
Yeah, that's kind of the big thing. I don't have too many things to say that, I disagree with him so far.
I didn't disagree with anything you've said so far because I didn't speak up. Still curious about his perception of evolution, but I don't think he's going to explain that, so it's not even that big of a deal. We know what actually happens. So.
Yeah. All right, so next time, starting with part 3.